evening and welcome to Tripping on Legends. I am your host, Christopher Balzano. I am on multiple platforms tonight, although not all of my platforms. It's been kind of a crazy afternoon here in Southwest Florida. Not the least odd thing of which is almost all of my research for this case has disappeared. And so I had to kind of duplicate it as I was sitting down this afternoon. If you've been following me on social media, you know that this is kind of an interesting thing. It's been playing out for 2 weeks. My exposure to this case, which began to this legend, which began very subtle, I'm going to say, with a request or kind of a, hey, why don't you come out and check out this location from my good friend Della, who is working with me on This Town is Myth. And it ended up becoming a great example of This Town is Myth, in addition to being a weird mystery in and of itself. If you're not following me on social media, now's the time to. I can be found every Tuesday night from 8:30 to 10 o'clock on midnight.fm. In addition to, at the same time when I do that, I go Facebook Live through Facebook / Tripping on Legends. And Tripping on Legends, the Facebook part of it, is really kind of the dump site for everything that you want to find out about Tripping on Legends. Articles, news stories that come up, things that I'm doing, artwork. It all kind of is posted there, as well as being posted on trippingonlegends.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Spooky Balzano, and on IG, which I'm not on IGTV tonight. Sorry for my IG fans. At Spooky Tripping. A ton of ways to follow everything that is going on with the weirdness that is the Ocala. Well, the weirdness that is Florida to begin with, you know. I've done a few radio interviews this week, and, you know, all of them are not from Florida. All of them are from someplace else, and they all begin with how weird it must be to be doing all of this in Florida. And the only thing I can answer is yes, hell yes. Having done this in Massachusetts, having done this in New England, I know that there are weird things that happen in every state, right? But Florida is lost history, and that kind of goes with what we're going to be talking tonight. I'm not quite sure what happens when you go out west and you're dealing with the Wild West, and you're dealing with the, you know, country that was discovered and kind of settled in weirdness and, you know, and on the fly. But in New England, everything seems documented. Everything seems to have its time, its place. You know, there's some weirdness. You have to kind of get through some of the weird writing in terms of some of the written history, the oral history that was then put down. But, you know, it's straightforward. The mystery is in what had happened. In Florida, that's not necessarily the case. There are, it would seem, more ghost towns in Florida than in any other state that I've talked to other people from. I'm not downing any other state, as a matter of fact. I think that Florida is one of the weirdest places to live, partly because we have this reputation, this history of not only modern things, right? Hashtag Florida Man and see what you find, but also of lost history. And it takes two different forms. And both of those forms are kind of in effect tonight. The one form is towns that just disappear. We've talked about this before in the show, this idea, and Pemberton Ferry is an excellent example of that. Pemberton Ferry is the focus of the This Town is Myth project. A town is settled. A town lasts for a little bit because the railroad goes through it, or the turpentine companies are able to find a really good place to settle into, and they create a logging camp that then disappears. Or, and this is a really big part of Florida's history, it's citrus land, or it's celery land, and frosts kill everything. And rather than kind of waiting it out, they don't have that kind of time, they pick up and they leave. And oftentimes that involves, just because of the nature of homesteads and the nature of houses, they tear down their house and they leave, right? They tear down the house and they travel with the wood that once began their house. We talked about this when we talked about the cemetery up in the Panhandle, Coon Hill Cemetery, where you can't find the town anymore because literally everyone physically moved the town with them when they went to other places. That happens time and time again in Florida. It's one of the things that make trying to discover old folk tales and trying to discover old haunted history and even just history in general such a challenge. But it also adds to the mystique of these locations because the government buys back the land, and oftentimes, maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's something at play, things burn down. Things have a nasty habit in Florida of burning down just when people try to grasp the history of a location. But then there's the other element to it, which is a lot of these small towns in Florida want to keep their secrets. It's kind of the entire focus of this town is myth, is this idea that these places are haunted, these places are, they have maybe some kind of legend that people used to talk about, but people don't talk about it anymore, right? Or they have a haunting that people are still experiencing, right? So it's a legend of a location which still has some kind of activity in it, but people don't share it with outsiders. And so, as someone who tries to record that and then experience that, it's very difficult to track down a story. And oftentimes, you can find more information in an old newspaper than you can on the streets, that you can kind of going down and talking to people. Traditionally, what Tripping on Legends did was we did all this research, and then we would go to the location, we would try to talk to people and say, hey, have you heard this story? Have you heard? There are certain places in Florida that you just can't do that. And one of those places is Sumter County. It is ground zero, if you will, for this town is myth, as well as some other interesting things that I've been looking into. If you listened to episode 85 of Tripping on Legends, where we talked about the boogeyman and we talked about Little Miss Panosofsky and this idea that people don't even talk about the murder anymore. They don't talk about specifics, and they definitely don't talk about who might have actually been doing the weird things that are going on, right? And if you haven't listened to that episode, you need to go back and listen to that episode as soon as you finish listening to this one, because it's kind of a game changer for Tripping on Legends and the launch of a very important and kind of involved project that we're going to be working on that I need people's help with. I need people to kind of step in and help me with the research of this, as well as kind of help me generate stories about it. It's crazy. I was just looking at it, and I have 4 years of archived episodes. So if you're looking at this and you're seeing episode 86, the actual number that's up there is more like 120 between live shows that we did that didn't used to have numbers attached to them, special kind of one-off offshoot episodes. So there's a lot to go into. So I would highly suggest, if you're not subscribed to Tripping on Legends wherever you get your podcasts, that you do that sometime this week. Do yourself a favor. New Year's resolution to make yourself happy. Best way to make yourself happy, download Tripping on Legends. And if you're a fan of the show, or even if you are not necessarily a fan of the show, but you think it's good a little bit, leave a review. Leave a review. As of right now, all the reviews just mention what an idiot I am. So it would be good to have some a counterbalance to that. Maybe it's not. So there is this kind of paradox, not paradox, I would say, but more kind of like an odd comparison between New England and Florida. Dave Francis, who's in the chat right now, said he found so much going through the newspapers of the 1900s when he was doing his evaluation of the Stones Tavern murder and the hauntings that are involved there. Well documented. But also people who are willing to talk. So not far from Stone's Tavern that he's talking about is the town of Rehoboth. And Rehoboth famously is not only the hometown, or at least the adopted hometown of Charles Robinson, who wrote New England Ghost Files, which kind of became a famous book, but it's also the landing pad for so many of the hauntings in the Bridgewater Triangle, right? And people talk about the hauntings. People are willing to point them out to you. People will tell you, oh, you've seen this. Have you also heard about this one? That's kind of the nature of haunted folklore. That's what I thrive on. And yet there are some parts of Florida, once you get out of the cities, they don't talk about stuff, right? It's a dead zone, literally and figuratively. Give me 1 sec here. This is the beauty of doing live radio. I left my Robert coffee a little bit out of range. Della, Doctor, when we were working on This Town is Myth, she contacted me with a list, the Sumter County, Florida list of strange places, right? And we explored the we explored the Little Miss Panosofsky case and got into a little bit the murders that happened in the cemetery and where is the cemetery of Little Miss Panosofsky, which we're still looking into. And on that list was also another reference to a murder, right? And so if you're talking about things that are weird, a murder isn't necessarily, in and of itself, weird. What develops around that murder is kind of what makes it part of history. And it can't just be that it was a gruesome murder, right? I wonder how infamous the Lizzie Borden murders, Andrew Borden murder, would be if there was no touch to it, right? If it was just this huge massacre, or even if there was a trial to it and no one had ever heard of a ghost there, would we still remember Lizzie Borden? Would we still remember these other locations where a murder happens, but there isn't necessarily a modern story attached to it, right? Those are history. The ghost stories that are attached to it bring that history into the present and make it relevant to us today. We love true crime, right? If you go through Netflix, if you go through all the streaming services, if you go through the New York Times bestseller list, the books that are driving the economy, the movies and the documentaries that are driving the economy seem to be true crime. Maybe it's just the people I hang around with, I don't know. But if there isn't something modern to it, why continue to look at it, right? The exception maybe being Jack the Ripper, but of course, the intrigue with that is that science, just like we talked about in last week's episode, the science of discovering who done it makes it relevant today because people keep exploring it. This seemed like a pretty open and shut case. A murder happened, someone was convicted of it, someone was found guilty and convicted of it. That person, assuming, went to jail and served time for it. There is now the house where the murder happened is still there. The house where the murder happened is still there. There's a little cemetery where the two people who were murdered are buried. Hunters come across it all the time. People are taking care of it. It's like a historic location, and so there's a certain amount of attention that's being given it, mainly because of the two people who are buried there. And that's it. That's it. And I went out there to touch the Little Miss Panosofsky case to look at the location where the body was found, and this was kind of an add-on. It became so much more the more that I looked into it, and it's one of those situations, and it's one of those haunted legends that you keep peeling it and peeling it and peeling it and finding other aspects of it that are like, why is there not a movie made of this? Right? Why is there not a something dedicated to what exactly is going on here? Because there is so much to kind of unwrap with this case. There's so much to kind of unpack with it that it's, well, why don't we just get into it? And it starts with the premise of if a ghost haunts in the woods and no one's there to hear it, is the location haunted? Writing for the Ledger in 2009, October 25th, 2009, Linda Charlton, who I've now seen her name on a few different things, writes about tonight's location. October 25th, 2009. If I could, I would bet all the money in my pocket versus all the money in your pockets that that's going to be a Sunday. Because she's writing about hauntings. She's writing about ghost stories. And she writes this: there is no ghost story that comes out of the Stewart Homestead. At least none that have withstood the passage of time. And I think that just about says it all for tonight's legend, which is the ghost and the murder at the Stewart Homestead. If you are not from Florida, it's really hard to understand what a swamp is, right? And I can't testify for any swamps in Louisiana, which are famous for their swamps, or any other places. You have in your mind a vision or an idea of what a swamp is. Mine is molded by old episodes of Scooby-Doo, where they always seem to be like rowing through a swamp. Countless episodes or countless editions of Swamp Thing comics. Florida swamps don't look like that. I remember us going to, it was not a legend trip, it was actually a trip for work, and Natalie and I and all the kids were driving through the Everglades. And I kind of looked around and went, well, this is the Everglades? Like, I expected something, I don't know what I expected, but I didn't expect, especially in the dry season, which is the winter, it just looks like woods, right? When Della was taking me out to this, I asked her what kind of shoes I should wear, and she kind of was like, "Oh, what do you mean? What kind of shoes should you wear?" And I was like, "Well, I'm going through the woods. I'm going through the swamp. I don't want to wear good shoes. I don't want to wear." And so, she's like, "You don't really have to worry about that. Maybe if it had been raining a little bit more, there would have been a little bit, but the swamps of Florida dry up to some degree, especially the setting for this legend, which is the Green Swamp. The Green Swamp has an entire history, a lot of which has to do with creepy things. But if you were to go there in January, it doesn't seem like a swamp. It seems like the woods with maybe a little bit of wet ground. And I think that adds to kind of the mystery of this, because it's a Gemini of locations, right? And one time it's a creepy woods where you can walk from here to there, and then in the summertime it's a swamp, right? It's as primordial and inaccessible as you would imagine something to be. And we explored a little bit of this when we went to visit the Hog Island Witch, in terms of you could see the water lines on the trees between where we were at the time when we had been there and kind of where the water sometimes gets to. That adds to the mystique of the location because there are some elements of this that are disappearing, if you will. The Green Swamp is known for monsters, right? I first heard about it. I was looking at, I just kind of, it's funny, I found this sticky note. Like, that's the things you find that tell you should go on. This sticky note that says, check towns of the Emerald Hell, Green Swamp Wilderness Preserve. And if you were just to come upon that sticky note, you would have no idea. But then you're like, the Emerald Hell? Like, oh my word, like that has to be the most interesting thing I've ever heard of. And it all began with, looking into Weird Florida. And in Weird Florida, and then in Mark Muncie's book, Freaky Florida, they get a little bit into the swamp monster, right? And this idea that in addition to potentially there being skunk apes that kind of inhabit the location, that there's also maybe a history of misidentified wild men, right? People who go and live in the swamp. We can't conceive that if we're not there, right? If we're not mountain people, I shouldn't say mountain people, if we're not swamp people, if we're not outdoors people, we can't imagine going into a swamp and just living, right? That there's plenty of food there. You could live an entire life just off the vegetation you find and the small animals you find and gator meat and all this. We would have no concept of this idea. But throughout history, there have been people who have disappeared. Florida is the place where people go to, especially in the early days of it being a state, to get away, right? To rediscover yourself or get away from a life that you had. And a lot of that involved going into the swamp or going into these like really secluded places and just living off the land, which people still do, right? People are still kind of making their life in these kinds of places throughout Florida. And it's crazy when you go there. The Rainbow Children and the remnants of the Rainbow Children that stay in the Ocala year long are kind of an example of this. That leads to reports of cryptids, right? These unidentified monsters, whether it be, like I said, a traditional skunk ape, whether it be a wild man who seems to have supernatural abilities. There is the Moss Man, not Mothman, but Moss Man, which I think I'm going to do an entire episode on, who's said to be there, who's, once again, kind of like a Bigfoot, but a little bit smaller, and covered in this green, sometimes glowing moss. These are absolutely normal reports for that kind of location, right? If you get a secluded area where it's untouched to some degree, potentially there were people living in there, potentially there are animals that have never been identified, you're going to get these cryptid reports. So it makes sense that the Green Swamp has this deep and rich history of supernatural, we'll call it. Not paranormal, we'll call it supernatural. I don't trip those, right? And so I kept kind of pushing off. There's one little story that maybe was kind of haunted legendy, but involved like going into the swamp, deep into the swamp. And I'm like, I ain't going deep into no swamp. So I kind of pushed these stories off, which is why this random sticky note was attached to something as I was researching this week. I found it and went, oh my word. When the water recedes back, the Stewart Homestead can be seen in all of its glory. And if you're following the social media, you saw the pictures that I posted at the time, and also since. It's a four wall shack. Well, I shouldn't even say 4 walls, right? It's 3 walls and a roof. It's deteriorated over time. It has, and this was a bone of contention, it has a steel roof on it, which is completely covered in moss and leaves and debris. The wood is rotted and has holes in it. Famously, there's a stump in the middle which was used as a table, which was supposed to be like the homey touch that was added to this house where Isham and Sally lived for at least, I have 10 years, could be longer than that. Um, 10 years is what I was able to find. If someone can correct me on that, I will totally take that. Um, Isham was born in 1860. Sally was born in 1845, so she's actually 15 years younger than him. He had never married, he had never had kids. He kind of accumulated a little bit of wealth, accumulated a little bit of land. He met Sally, who was originally Sally Browning. Later in life, they fell in love? Question mark. And they moved out to this area of the swamp. And he raised a little cattle. He did a few other things to earn money, but it was a very simple life. Sometime in early 1918, while they were living there, the country was failing, right? We're talking Great Depression, we're talking banks failing, we're talking insecurity, not necessarily knowing what was going on in the economy. And so, if you know your history, people started pulling their money out of banks and things like that. That's what Isham did. He pulled all of his money. It said that he pulled all of his money out of the bank and was storing it at the homestead. Now, if you're living in a mansion, you're living in a house where you've got like a bed that's got, yeah, okay, I can see that. If you've got property, maybe you bury the money. Like I'm seeing this. If you could see these pictures of what this house is, and it wasn't much more than that then, it would be like living in a tool shed and storing all of your money in the shed and being like, this is the most secure place. May 1918. No one knows exactly how long they had been dead, but their dead bodies were found. Every account that I've read, what it mentions is the vultures. So some hunters who were in the woods came upon the homestead and saw the vultures on the roof and knew something was up. When they went inside, they found Isham and Sally brutally murdered. There's one report that they were chopped up, like literally chopped up, like there was a hand and there was a foot. There's another report that that Sally had been sexually assaulted, but for all accounts, they were brutally killed. That it was a horrible, horrible crime scene made worse by the coming summer heat and the animals and the deterioration of the bodies. Here's from the very beginning. Here, the story doesn't necessarily. The story splits, right? So the sheriff's brought in, and one story goes that they looked at all of the massacre that was in front of them. And this is the story I kind of go with a little bit. One of them was found in bed, both of them were found in bed, that they packed the whole thing up in the rug that was on the floor, carried them what's got to be 30 yards to the cemetery, to what is now the cemetery, and buried them right there. That it was such a horrible crime scene, they dare not even like take it out of the location. Which kind of sounds odd to me, right? I mean, I understand that I don't fully comprehend or appreciate Florida history and Florida criminology of the 1900s, but that seems weird that they didn't bring the bodies in, especially because there is one thing that said that later a coroner had declared that they had been there for at least a week, and it's not the idea that they had been there for a week, or even that a coroner had been called or referenced, but the fact that it said later, right? So it's almost as if they had brought the bodies in for an examination. And why would you not, right? It's obviously a murder. I've read The Alienist. The Alienist takes place, 20 years before that, right? I've read even Jack the Ripper, other murder cases where you collect the evidence, right, for something. So this idea that they that they just pushed everything into a rug and instantly went and buried them is kind of an odd twist to the story and really hard to believe, but it adds to the simplicity of the location. This is one of those details that gets repeated over and over again that I think is false. And we kind of examine that when we wrap the site. And that is that to get the bodies out, they had to take off one whole wall of the house so that they could remove the bodies through that wall. That detail always kind of stuck in my head. And when Della, John, and I were at the location, we were looking at it saying, like, you could just bring them through the door. Like, if the opening's big enough, like, it doesn't make sense. Supposedly, they also brought the bed out through that side or through the door at some point. So that was taken out. There are also reports that for years, people would find little coils from the bed near the location as if they had been scattered, which adds to the mystery of it. Much like Lizzie Borden, it was said that they were murdered with an axe, that someone had hacked them up. This location, this homestead, is on Tonic Road in the Green Swamp Wildlife Management Area, which is an odd place within an odd place. And it's a place that's kind of even evolving right now. Very quickly, they got on to the fact, because they could find no money. There had been reports that Isham had been talking about money and talking about how he had taken his money out, that it had to be an inside job. It had to be someone who knew the family. And the first people who kind of came up were her nephew, a guy by the name of Josh Browning. And the weird thing is that Josh Browning, once again, there's another part of the story that kind of flips. He was not the original suspect, although people kind of informally thought it was him, but rather they thought it was his dad and his uncle. So Sally's two brothers had kind of converged on this and like plotted to kill their sister and get all this money. There are conflicting news reports, but the story kind of goes, this has got to be like the dumbest criminal of all time. This would happen today in Florida and be a hashtag Florida man story. According to the news reports I was able to find, Josh's father, who I think was also named Joshua, that's why they keep calling Josh and Joshua, and the uncle were brought in, and they were kind of not put on trial, but the first trial that they give you, which the name is totally escaping me, when they just see if there's enough evidence to go to trial. Josh pulls up to the inquest to testify on behalf of his father in a new car. Like, you can't make this shit up. He actually pulls up to the inquest. They call it an inquest in the papers, in a new car with the money that he got from murdering his aunt. Like, how stupid is that? The focus shifts to Josh. It said that him and his friend, John Tucker, were seen plotting it, like seen hanging out, talking about the fact that they needed money. Some of the evidence presented was that they were seen together that day, kind of walking from the miles from wherever, I can't remember where, it wasn't Tavares, it was someplace near Dade City, I think it was Dade City, to this part of the swamp. Tucker said they didn't know each other, so to actually have these conflicting reports, he said, we don't know each other, but hey, people have seen us together. That he had asked his mom, that Josh had asked his mom about the money, like, hey, does Auntie Sally, like, did she really take the money out? That he was able to go to an expensive hotel in St. Pete afterwards. and that his accomplice, Tucker, had that one of his relatives had been flashing around money. And when asked, she said, "Oh, like John gave me this money." So where had John given him? Where had John gotten that money to give her? So it's really kind of this. I was not able to find one account that said they were able to attach any kind of evidence to it, that they were able to find, their fingerprints any place, that there were bloody boot prints, any kind of forensic, even like, old school forensics, that they were able to find the money. As a matter of fact, most of the reports talk about how the money had been hidden in the swamp, and that there then became like this treasure, crazy, like, almost like trying to discover pirate treasure. We get these conflicting reports that come out of this. Half the papers, which seem to be quoting each other, say both men were convicted, both men were given 20 years, which I think is really crazy, right? Isn't that like a small, they kill two people, they get 10 years for each person that they killed. Once again, I only know what I know from TV shows, but when you kill somebody in the process of another crime, like robbing them, you're in Florida, man. Like, why aren't you hung? Like, why is there not some kind of more severe penalty than 10 years? But then there are other reports which don't even hint at, they come straight out and say that Josh turned on John, that he had no plans to commit this murder, to even rob them, but that John had kind of forced him to do it, and he was going to testify against him. Right? Those are the official things. It's interesting because when we're talking about sources, we always assume that the further you get away from something that happened, the less convincing the evidence is, right? So when you read my book, for example, and my book references Mark's book, and Mark's book references Weird Florida, you should, you should have like a moment of pause, right? You should be like, wait a minute, you need to evaluate that evidence. You would think when you look at newspapers, right? What I tell my students, like, first sources or primary sources, you should be able to trust them, and yet there are papers that tell differing things about how this trial went. There are court records, and so you kind of have to go with the court records, and the court records, according to the person who put up this memorial a few years ago, who is part of the Green Swamp Wildlife Management Area, they put up a memorial and kind of cleaned up the area a little bit. Della takes care of it now as well. That they said each person got 20 years. 20 years for 2 murders and a felony robbery at the same time. Doesn't make sense to me. You have to understand that Sumter County is a place of secrets. This whole case began for me with the idea that, if there's no haunting and no one's talking about a haunting in a place that should be haunted, right? Isn't that evidence that something weird is going on? No, Chris, of course not. Not every place has got to be haunted. Ghosts aren't even real. Blah, blah, blah. Doesn't matter whether ghosts are real. You have a court case that is mentioned multiple times in multiple books. You have a murder, a brutal murder. No ghost stories. Or no ghost stories that have, quote, withstood the passage of time. That's the story in and of itself. Why is no one talking about ghosts being at this location? Why is no one talking about the unsettled spirit of Sally and Isham? Why are there not people who trek out there in the middle of the night by moonlight to see the ghosts and to hear the last screams? But not even the court case makes sense, right? And I want you to, once again, we can't think of the mind of Josh Browning and John Tucker. We can't understand what they were going through. But to go into this location and massacre 2 people, not just kill, right? Like, okay, you can say, well, they had to kill them because they obviously knew Josh, and so they would have been caught. And it's not like they silently killed them, right? Reports of body parts having been chopped off. That's what we call in true crime and crime investigations overkill, right? You don't look at someone who you know unless you have rage for them and chop them up and potentially rape or allow your friend to rape your relative unless there's rage. And there's nothing in the history of Sally Browning Stewart to say that there was something that would cause that level of violence against her. But that's what happened. Josh goes to jail. Um, the weird thing is that even afterwards, who had committed the crime? Now he went to jail. Both him and Tucker went to jail. Even after the crime, years later, people had kind of a selective amnesia or some kind of weird veil put over their head because people started saying, no, 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 it was a cousin from Brooksville who had done it, and he was convicted of the crime and he's serving time in jail. Or no, it was this person who had come up. No, and Mark even puts forward in his book that it was so brutal that there were rumors of a cryptid, right? That a skunk ape or the wild man of the Green Swamp or the Green Swamp monster had actually done this murder. People forgot. People forgot who had done it, even though it's documented. Other people were still being charged with the crime. Hey, if it had happened a little later, I would be talking about that Schaefer had done it. Josh goes to jail. At some point, and we're looking at not too many years later, in jail he meets up with Luther Wilson. So this is the kind of part of the story, like when you tell when you tell a tale of a ghost story, and I haven't talked about the ghost at all. You've noticed there are other elements that come in, and this is like a three-ring circus because when Josh goes to jail, it's kind of almost like that's where the story starts. Um, he meets a guy named Luther Wilson, and for all intent and purposes, Luther Wilson, who I've heard different reports of where he was from. That he was from Dade City, that he was from Claremont. He was the bad boy of Pasco County, right? Like he was always in trouble with the law, minor crimes, a little bit of robbing, a little bit of assault, right? He finally went to jail for the attempted rape of his sister in law, which the newspapers called, this is one of those interesting euphemisms, called the an attempted outrage against his sister in law. But Luther Wilson is a daring man. Daring is the word that came up oftentimes in relation to him. He was a wild guy. He was from all. I've never been able to get his actual date from all of these newspapers articles, and I've read at least 7 articles about him. They never talk about how old he is, but I get the impression that he's young. He escapes. He escapes from that Pasco jail, and he murders a Lake County deputy, um, a man by the name of Deputy Bob Wilson. So Bob Wilson on the 4th of July, 1918. So this is 2 months after the murders. They were trying to apprehend him at his brother's house. I'm assuming this is a different brother than the one he tried to rape his wife. And the shootout occurred, and he killed late Deputy Bob Wilcox. So that's in 1918. Bob Wilcox, Officer Wilcox, is buried, and then it's not until almost 100 years later, in 2013, like an official monument to having died in service is put up with him. And a lot of the material about Luther Wilson comes from writing about the honorable burial of Bob Wilcox 100 years later. He escapes the shootout, and they eventually find him in the Green Swamp. And he is sentenced to 20 to life. Again, that seems really odd. Killing the cop while you're on the run from another crime. How is that not a capital offense, right? How is that not something where he should be put to death? And keep in mind, this is 1918, so this is like still the death penalty is on the books in Florida. I would love to have someone comment on that who knows more about the criminal history of Florida. At some point in the next 2 years, he meets up with Browning in jail. They're at Rayford Prison, and they give Wilson a rifle and a horse, and they allow him to be the caretaker of the other prisoners who are out working. The fix has got to be in, right? Like, something's got to be weird about this. He's given a rifle and a horse and told, watch out for the other prisoners. Like, your job is to guard the prisoners. It reminds me of, which would be, I don't know exactly where Rayford Prison is, but based on kind of the geography of this, it's kind of reminds me of the DeLand Prison, where Isaiah Cooper, who had supposedly killed Marshall Bowman, was told, yeah, just go work in the swamp. And then he escaped because the guy didn't want to get his shoes dirty. Yes, welcome to Florida, exactly. He escapes, and Josh Browning escapes with him. Josh Browning is never seen again. Vanishes off the face of the planet. We don't get any word of what happened to Wilson, right? I have no reports of what happens to him after he serves. I'm sorry, John Tucker. What happens to him after he serves his time? But Browning vanishes. Yes, Rayford, from what I understand, is near Stark because Stark was referenced several times, and of course Stark falls into our storyline because we touched upon Stark in terms of the jail that's there now. They finally find Wilson in the Green Swamp. He is, he's shot in the face and chest, right? They open fire on him, take him down on the spot. Florida justice. He had built or kind of taken control of a fort in the woods, right? A fort in the woods that said could hold anywhere between 5 and a dozen people. Like, did he have troops out there? Did he have like a posse out there? Did he have a gang out there? Including an 80-foot observation tower. Old base? And so the story seems to end. No haunting. No one is talking about at all that you can see the spirits of the Stewarts at this location. No one is talking about how there might be something to look into, right? How do you legend trip something that no one talks about, right? Like, how do you legitimately go in and say, like, I'm going to try to get these ghosts? So I went there a few weekends ago, 2 weekends ago now, and I just took recordings. I haven't had a chance to go over the tapes. I'd be interested to find something, and I really was doing it as a formality. This is not entirely odd, but I'm gonna throw it out there. You're in the swamp. I get it. Dead zone. No phones working at this location. No phones working. No internet connection whatsoever. We went a mile, 2 miles away to another location where there are similar huts to the homestead houses, and I had the internet. I could go on. This specific location, phones, internet, completely dead, not working. The weird thing is, I'll call her Jasmine Star. I contacted Jasmine Star, who is in addition to other things and being a podcast host, is a psychic. And so if I've got stories that kind of have a little bit of a weird tinge to them that I think that might benefit from her touch, I contact her. I sent her about 7 messages while I was at this location, and none of them went through. Makes sense, right? If you have an internet connection, your phone might not be working. I'm texting her as I'm doing this. The only message that went through, of the 7 that I sent to her, the only message that went through was, "Could use your vision." That's it. And she was sending me messages, and her messages didn't come through until after I got out. The one message that went through the entire time I was at the location was my message to her, "Could use your vision," which of course meant contacting them psychically. Going back to it, I've been teaching my students about the impact of repetition, right? October 25th, 2009. There are no ghost stories that come out of the Stewart Homestead. At least none that have withstood the passage of time. Essentially, it's not haunted. There's no ghostly legends attached to it. There's nothing weird and mysterious. And yet, dead zone. Della felt, when we were there, who is psychically connected in extreme cases, had to leave. She had to walk out of the house. She couldn't stand to be in the house. There was something so heavy and oppressive there. And then I come across these 2 things. The first is an article in the Daily Commercial published October 20th, 2019. I'm not familiar with anything that is referenced in this story, right? This I just kind of recently discovered. The highlight, the headline reads, Mineola, haunted house provides scares for a cause. And it's called The Nightmares in the Swamp. Haunted house in Mineola is offering scares for the entire family with 4 levels to choose from, including full, medium, light, and lights on, and no scare experiences for $10 a person, blah, 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 blah. So this local businessman, Troy Grimes, created this Green Swamp Escapes, which was a haunted house in Mineola. The focus of this haunted house is the Stewart murders and the ghosts that are associated with it. Now, I am dying to talk to either Roxanne Brown, who wrote the article, or Troy, except for, like I said, I just came across this, or Troy Grimes, as to why this was the subject of a haunted house. Were there stories? Right? We've talked about Sumter County doesn't talk about what's going on. Are there people who are? Are there people who are whispering enough to formulate 4 levels of haunted houseness attached to a murder case? Right? there's got to be something that's being whispered. And then before then actually, I came across, and I furiously messaged Della when I found this. Now, for those of you who don't know me and don't know actually how pretty much blind of a bet I am, I'm going to have to put on my reading glasses for this. So if you've never seen me in glasses, this might be a little weird. This is from December 6th, 1970. December 6th, 1970. And the title of it is Florida's Green Swamp, Untamed and Full of Legends. The article is by Nixon Smiley, and I guess he had like a regular column that was called Viewing Florida. In it, he talks about these different places all connected to the Withlacoochee River, right? And all these different kind of stories that come out of there, but then people who just have lived in the area or were connected to the area. And it starts talking about, things that the Army Corps of Engineers did when they were there. And it talks about this Roy Bronson, who owns some of the land there and owned some land there and then like kind of moved off from it. And in interviewing Roy, they talked to his wife. And I'm going to read to you what she said, some of the parts of that, what she said. Miss Bronson knows something about the wilderness because the Bronsons spent their honeymoon at the old Stewart place in the middle of the Withlacoochee River Basin, 12 miles from the nearest road. So what they're referring to in that is the Stewart Homestead. Well, everyone did think the Stewart place had haunts. Haunts spelled H-A-I-N-T-S. Says Bronson. Nobody wanted to stay in that place after the Stewarts were murdered. Well, everybody did think the Stewart place had haunts. Nobody would stay there. Nobody would stay there. Goes on. The story is that they overcame a mounted guard and rode his horse to Central Florida. That's her talking about the escape I had talked about earlier. So in the story that she had been told, it's not that they escaped on their own because they were left to guard the other prisoners, but they had a daring, like they overtook the cop, they stole the horse, they stole the guns, and they rode off into the sunset. Wilson soon killed a deputy sheriff in a shootout and then killed himself from an ambush by lawmen, which once again we know is not true because the shootout that they're talking about, him killing a cop, happened before he went to jail with, or did it? Browning, however, laid out in the vast Withlacoochee wilderness for several years. That would be Pemberton Ferry, right? That would be this town is myth. So this murderer was hiding in the woods during the time that Pemberton Ferry is having its kind of last. Notice Pemberton Ferry not mentioned anywhere here. The secret of whether he recovered his grandfather's cattle money died with him. Grandparents' cattle money died with him. Nobody, this is once again Bronson talking, Miss Bronson, nobody would live in the Stewart house. Eventually, it was burned in a wood fire. My daddy built a log cabin there for the cow hunters to stay. And that's where my wife and I lived for a year. So I guess that's Roy Bronson talking. Until the first high water, corrected Mrs. Bronson. We had come to Claremont and it rained while we were away. Before we could get back, the whole... It's cut off. The whole... Because the next thing it says is the whole pregnant and I refuse to go back to the old Stewart place. They thought, yes, they thought it was full of evil spirits. To the point that people were talking about it. Before she got there, people were saying that there was a ghost there, right? It reminds me of the ghost train, which was running through Pemberton Ferry, which kind of runs parallel to with Lahuchi, who that it was so well known. People in other states refused to travel that line, refused to work that line, because the ghost of this train and the people who had been hit by the train, they decapitated, murdered, mangled, and all this stuff, and it was so well known they wouldn't work it, and then at some point, people stopped talking about it. There's a lot going on in this article. It was known to be haunted. No one's talking about it. No one talked about it. We're only talking 100 years, right? That means newspapers, journals, like Della has found Bibles that reference things. There are no writings talking about the weird things that are going on there. Yet in this 1970s interview, a woman who lived in the house after the murders said, yeah, everybody knew it was haunted. Everyone was talking about it. So we burned it down. Which, of course, leads to the next logical thing. The house is not the murder house. Right? It's not nearly as historical. Now, it doesn't say when she actually moved to that location, when they moved, the Bronsons moved there, right? But it had to have been post the murder. Which means that the house that now stands there is not nearly as historical, not nearly as important as was led to be. Which means that the wall that's missing from the house was not taken down because they had to get the bodies out or they couldn't fit the bed. The story is lost. And I understand, like Margie's saying, you didn't speak of the dead back then. It would bring bad luck. And yet, how many of the haunted legends that we see from other states does talk about the dead from 100 years ago? And there are articles written about it. And there are, even if euphemisms are thrown in, we understand that they're talking about the dead and ghosts. Even if you use something like attempted improprieties or whatever the phrase was, like, yeah, we don't do it the same way we do now, but in another sense, we did it a lot more, right? I mean, we have a deeper connection to things like spirituality and the idea of ghosts being real before science kind of came along and killed the ghosts, except the ones that can be caught by investigators, that the dead were among us. But not in Sumter County. Not in Central Florida. It's interesting that so many stories from hunters would get out about monsters in the swamp. And here we have people who we can take a step back, only because we have to default to goodness in some way. We can take a step back and say these were innocent victims. A brutal murder, haunting that is so bad it's considered to be evil spirits, right? So evil spirits not being the spirits of the people who were in the house. So bad they had to exorcise the site by burning down the house. My house. Sorry. They don't talk about it. It didn't happen. It didn't exist. When is a ghost story not a ghost story? When people stop believing it, when people stop telling it. How do you legend trip that? How do you... It's extremely frustrating to have the history of a place in one hand, to have these conflicting reports in the other, and yet to ultimately being able to say, people don't talk about it. Sometimes not talking about it says as much about the people of a community as it does talking about it. Like the story that they actually spread, right? the search continues. I can't leave it alone, right? I've got to continue to dig to see if I can find reports from the middle of the century, right? Reports from the World War I era, the Depression era, to see if there's anything where people are talking about the Stewart Homestead other than what's been repeated time and time again for the last 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. Because none of the published reports that I looked at, whether it was Weird Florida, I'm not sure if Weird Florida actually mentions it specifically, Mark's Freaky Florida, articles online, websites that talk about ghosts, none of them mention the ghosts that are there. No one mentions anyone ever talking about it. So it's a different kind of legend trip. It's a different kind of story and a different narrative that has to be told about this. A friend of mine, author Douglas Ford, was like, I don't get it. Like, you're talking about a haunted house that's not haunted. It's not that it's not haunted. It's that no one wants to admit that it's haunted. And this is different than homeowners not wanting to for it to get out that weird stuff is happening because they want to sell the house or because they don't want their family to be seen weird. There are no chips in this hand, right? There's no flesh in the game. What are they gonna do? Like just tear it down again? Why would people stop talking about it? For the same reason that the road leading to this green swamp wildlife management area, I think it was Green Swamp West, if I'm not mistaken, was the road we had to take, like the area that we were in. Drive down that road, you're going to see police tape in the woods. Active cases. No one's talking about them. It's not even on the news, I've been told. It's only whispered about in some Facebook groups and things like that, that there might be an active dark force working there. Human dark force working in that area. They're not even talking about that. What's the motivation of that, right? Why that kind of silence? Why will no one talk about what people saw with that train? Why will no one say anything that a town called Pemberton Ferry ever existed? Why are people not talking about the Swamp Witch? I can continue with these questions that are in that area, and the only conclusion I can come to, the only part of the story that I can present to you, the only narrative that I can say to you tonight is, stay tuned. It's an unfolding story, and it continues to be, no matter what I look into, from Little Miss Panosofsky to where is she buried and what happened and why is the murder of the couple unsolved, to is there an active serial killer in that area, to why don't people talk about the ghosts in the Stewart Homestead? Did Josh Browning do it? Stay tuned. It continues. And it continues to unravel, because the more whispers that we can throw out there, the more ears will hear them. And the more ears that hear them, the greater the potential for a whisper back. And when you're dealing with a haunted location, when you're dealing with history and the haunted history of a location, sometimes a whisper is all you really need. If you want to find out if any of this will ever come to a conclusion, the best thing you can do is continue to listen to Tripping on Legends. I guarantee you next week we are leaving This Town is Myth, and we are leaving the Ocala, or at least the west side of the Ocala. Make sure that you are subscribing to the podcast anywhere where you get your podcast. Over 100 episodes are out there, dying for you to uncover the secrets and kind of add to the lore and the mystery that are these cases in Florida. You can follow us on social media. The best place is at Facebook, facebook.com/trippingonlegends, or our website, trippingonlegends.com. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I am at Spooky Balzano. And if you are on Instagram and you're not overly angry that I didn't do IGTV tonight, I am on Spooky Tripping. SpookyTripping@gmail.com is the best way to get in touch with me and share your story, your perspective on the stories I present, and anything that could maybe unlock some of these stories, or at least kind of throw out there some of the stories that are in your part of Florida or anywhere. I am Christopher Balzano, willing to go to your state to look at your haunted legend, especially if you're in New England and you get me up there and I can go home for a little bit. Thank you for tuning in to tonight's episode of Tripping on Legends. Please make sure you are following us. Please make sure you are reviewing the podcast, telling a friend about it, being active, because the only way that folklore can exist is if we spread it. So stay with me and spread it. That sounded really weird. Stay with me and spread it, but there you go. I'm Christopher Balzano, and here's hoping that all of your trips are legendary. I need an assistant for all this stuff. That way I can just go cue the music and they all of a sudden go, of course.